excuse me, 20 as they carry me. The Gemara here, I'm doing Niddah. I started last year, I was planning to finish in the summer, and then it was just too complicated because Niddah, I forgot how complicated it is. And so I ended up dropping that and doing Koreans for the time for my mother thing, and then I went to finish this. I finished a couple months ago already, but I was saving it for now. And as I'm sure many know, Niddah is not simply about the laws of Niddah, but all kind of rules of Tum and Tahara in general, and Ziva, and all the other things that go in there. And the last mission is one of the more complicated ones that we see. There's 7-11 rule, right? I'm sure many of you know what I'm talking about. 7 rule means if she sees the first 7 days is Niddah, and then the next 11 days is Ziva, right? So if a lady sees for the first time, then 7 days later, as long as she stopped by then, even if she saw down for all 7 days, she goes to mikveh and she's finished. On the other hand, then comes a period of 11 days, in which case if you see 1 day, you shomer Siyum kenegim. See 2 days, shomer Siyum kenegim. See 3 days, then you need 7 clean days. Nowadays we go to the super machmer option. We don't really have Niddah nowadays. You may or may not, but we never treated it as that. We always go for the worst possible scenario, which the Gemara, which is not grounded in law, as it were, but in practice. That I feel it relative dam kachardo, Yoshev long zayin nekin. Right? And even if a woman sees the slightest amount, which ordinarily would only be a shomer Siyum kenegim, but since people don't keep track of the 7-11 system that I just said, and the Rishonim found it complicated, it's well known that the Rambam, has his own interpretation, in which it's automatically 7-11, and all the others say it's just totally wrong. So it got complicated, so he simply said just be machmer across the board, and that's that. So I don't want to go. So I'll speak about something about this in a minute. So just for the formality of it, I'll just finish up the Gemara here because I don't think you really want to sit here and hear me talk about the machlokes, but Shama Beisol about it. She sees on the 3 days, on the 11th and the 12th and the 13th, like that. So the 3 days aren't over. The 3 days of Ziva already taking place after the 11 days of Ziva over. So you see how complicated it is. So let me just go and finish up the end. The Gemara itself doesn't want to end on a complicated note. And so it just says, is what we say in davening all the time, that anyone learns halachas. I guess that's very appropriate for Niddah because they have to be shown halachas. You have to memorize the halachas. There's not a lot of logic to a lot of things. We have to memorize like Torah's Kohen to know what all the different rules are. That the ways of the world are his. I'll take a look at the halachas, which means halachas, olam. Halachas, you get olam. Hadron because specifically mesechtas Niddah. That's just this up. Hadron mesechtas Hadron, Hadron mesechtas Hadron, mesechtas Hadron, Hadam 7 years out of the time, 7 years out of the time, 7 reading out of here.
I think that was me.
No, that was my father. Like I say, you go ahead and eat, and I'll try to make, and I'll say a few words. I don't remember where the thing was eating. What I did always, whenever you get something I need, I always like to see how the thematically and the Chaschina and the Samelach and all those books and things like this. And the best thing I can put together for you is on the following theme. The mesechtas Niddah, of course, talks about Niddah, but that's not all it talks about. There's all these complicated things like Niddah and Zava and this and that and the other. And when you sit down and if you have the patience to tell us on 1 or 2 or 3 particular points, it's actually very interesting. For example, the source of Tumas Niddah itself is in Vayikra. It's the 5 psukim. Listen closely. It says in chapter 15, it says, listen closely if you can. Isha Kitiya Zava. Doesn't say the word Niddah. It says Isha Kitiya Zava. She sees Dam. Dam Yazova B'Sara. It would be women or Basar. She was Yamim. The taste Tia B'Nidasa. For 7 days she'll be Niddah. That's what we call Niddah. On a gay body, whenever you touch her, anybody's touch her, you tell me till the evening. That's number 1. Then the next bus is Chosher Tishko Nirsa Yidma, Chosher Tishko Yidma. Mishko B'Moshav. She sits in a chair, or in a bed, that'll become tummy. Doesn't explain how much, but it says, then it says, anybody who touches the bed, anybody who touches the chair, it's time. So in other words, she's metame the chair, and the chair cannot be metame odom, so to speak. Okay? Which is a heavy tumor. And then the next pasuk is anybody who touches again a chair or a bed that she did becomes tummy. Same idea. Then it says, as an afterthought, it says that if the husband has a relationship with her, sleeps with her, Tehini also love when she saw Niddah, the tummy shib is yomim. Then it's not up to the evening. Then he becomes tummy for 7 days. And he's matami, the chair he sits on. So it introduces the idea like this. There's a tumas Niddah, what she has, and then there's something called boel Niddah, it's something different, which is the person who had to be with her, when he, of course he wasn't supposed to, but the consequences are that he becomes tummy as an avatumah. And then a little bit later, that's what it says over there, so it talks 99% about her, as you just saw, and then it says, in Achimos, here you go. V'el Yisha, when it says in the end, the things you read on Yom Kippur, Erev this, Lo Sigal, Erev Zah, Lo Sigal, it says, V'el Yisha Meniddah Tumosah, Lo Sigal L'Galas Erbasah. If someone's a Meniddah, you shouldn't go and be megalarized with it. Well, we already said that. You understand? Well, to be exact, here it says, thou shalt not do it, and earlier it says, if you did, here are the tumah consequences. It's a little bit, it's a little bit funny the way they do, which introduces to us the idea that there's something called tumas niddah, that's the halachas that involve what she touched and situ and all that, and then there's something called boel niddah. He becomes an avatumah of a certain type. The Rambam versus Sadi, I looked at the Minyan HaMitzvahs over here, and the Rambam, I won't take all the books out of it, says that one of the mitzvahs in the Torah is Niddah, and all the stuff that's involved in it. He doesn't get in all the details. He doesn't get bone Niddah, she this, she touches that. He says, Niddah is all one big parsha. And the Sadigon, who you may know was the first guy ever to compose the list of the Torah mitzvahs, I think even before the Bahag, if I'm not mistaken, around that time. In other words, the Rambam wrote a book called Sefer HaMitzvahs. The reason the Rambam wrote a book called Sefer HaMitzvahs is because he was angry. The reason he was angry because the Gaonim in Babylonia, 100, 200 years before him, had taken this Gemara, which says that there are Torah mitzvahs in the Torah, but the Gemara doesn't tell you what they are. And some of the Gaonim, like Sadigon and the Yehudai Gaon, they said, all right, we'll figure them out. And they composed lists of what they consider would be the Torah mitzvahs in the Torah. And not only that, but Sadigon was a poet, fancied himself a poet. And so he composed this whole long poem. It's not what we would call a poem, but to him it was, which you find in the Siddur Sadigon, published by Asaf. And the Bahag, the famous, they always quote in the halachas, he was one of the Gaonim also before the Mishonim. And he composed his list on there. And the famous poet in Spain, Ibn Gabiro, Shlomo Ibn Gabiro, he was a great poet. So he wrote Azharot. And he composed a poem for Shavuos. Because he was a great poet, so it became very popular. You understand? The assays, the los assays, used to be in shuls, all the shuls. It's one of the reforms the yeshivas have introduced into Orthodox Judaism. You understand? It's like they don't say Pirkei Avos anymore on Shabbos, they don't say Sher Malos on Shabbos. When I was a kid, they used to do all these things. So it used to be on Shavuos. If you look in the Maisa Ilfas, whatever you call it, Alphas, they have the Asharas. Nobody does it anymore. And they're now the Rambam freaked out, and the reason is because since Ibn Gabir was such a great poet, so for everybody all over the shul, it's part of, they all sing it, and they're wrong. For example, one of them, the 613 is Chanukah, near Chanukah. Understand? And I saw a couple others when I went through it. Some were a little bit more strange over there. So your Purim is also one of them. Yeah, whatever. So, the Rambam being no poet and totally mathematical, and it drove him crazy. He says this, by the way, it's not my joke. He says in the introduction to the Sefer HaMitzvahs, if you take the 12 read, he says, I can't stand that people repeating this, and they're wrong, like, you and me, who cares, but it's wrong, therefore he composed the Sefer HaMitzvahs, in which he says this subject has to be attacked scientifically. Therefore, he has like 13 shirashim in the beginning, 13 principles of exclusion. Because if you go through the Chumash, there's a lot more than 613. Everybody knows that. It depends what you include, what you exclude. So once you're already playing games, you're playing games. But the Rambam says some things that are very logical. For example, it says the same mitzvah over and over and over again. That doesn't count for 3, it counts for 1. Okay? So here also, the general approach of the Rambam is Lofia Inyan, Lofia Mitzvah. So since you have all these rules about Niddah that I just read you before, but the whole Inyan is one Inyan, like one parsha, therefore he counts it as 1. You see? The idea being, therefore, that he considers all the Dina Niddah and the Bo Niddah and all the things under one rubric. The Sadi Gaon has this famous commentator from Yerucham Fishel Perlau, who was this unknown Talmud of the Netziv, and he sat in his house before he was a millionaire. So he said, I don't know how he was a millionaire, sat in his house for years, but his wife must have been doing the work. He says in Warsaw, and he composed this massive thing when the Sadi Gaon, it's like a mesechtas, so to speak. And he said, no, the Sadi always goes with the pasuk, and therefore there are different laws in there. Now, it's not simply a matter of semantics. There are differences between Tumas Niddah on the one hand and Bo Niddah on the other hand. For example, as I just read you before, Tumas Niddah turns the seat in the bed into an avatuma. The princess and the pea. You're sitting on the top, and underneath a bunch of mattresses. This is also tummy. You see, that's where the avatuma. The Boel Niddah, the husband, he turns the seat in bed into a rishon l'tumah. See, and if you do the first one, the tumas niddah, the woman, the seat in bed is metami odom and kelim and ochlan and mashkin, like we just read in the Chumash. It says, any person who touched it, whatever. And if you go with the Boel Niddah, it only turns in the bed in the ochlan and mashkin and not odom and kelim. So it's that kind of thing. Now, the Rambam, very famously, says, he tries to bring some logic into it, right? Rambam brings a little logic into it, and he says in 3:3 that for a second, sorry. He says, Bo Niddah Niddah, there's someone that deal with the Niddah, has the same rules as he. Shu Avatuma, it's one of the Avatumas. Matami Kalim, Agamasa, but Masa, they tells all the different things in Matami. Ein Mishka Bo Niddah Merkava, Kamishka Niddah Merkava. But the rules of what he's Matami in terms of beds and seats is not identical with that of the Niddah. Shamishka Shadarsa of Niddah is Avmi Avaz Tuma. Mishka Bo is a Vlada Tuma. So like I told you before, one's an Avatuma, one's a Rishon Tuma. But Loma Nigris Tumas Mishka Tumas. Why is there a distinction between the others? He said that you have to know in the Gemara Niddah. It's one of those brushes that they have over there. When they should never Babol Niddah, was Sehini Dasa Love, the Tommy Shivas Yom. I just read you. This is the guy has be with her and he's not supposed to, of course, the Sehini Dasa Love, which is the state of Niddah, the Tommy Shivas Yom. And then it says in the next passage, and any bed he sits in will become Tommy, which is redundant. This is rare that the Rambam gives you a drasha. Why does it have to be redundant? So Torah Shalapeh, from the Sifra, they say that the pasuk is saying over there that the Boel Niddah is also very bad, but not as bad. It's not to get from the Tumah Chamor and put him in the Tumah Kala. So all this, like I say, is more on the technical side. And the Minchas Chinuch has a whole arichas where it gives you all the sheet of the Mishnah Melech. We went in this at infinitum. He gives you every sheet of which one says is Mataba B'maga, not B'masa, Behesed or not Behesed. This I won't bore you with the details. Now, the Rishonim and the Achronim have a very interesting, what seems to be a very interesting hakira over here, basic hakira. And that is this relationship of the guy to the wife. He's not supposed to have beer with her, but he did. What's the nature of the Isser? Is it Isser Niddah L'Bayla or Tumas Niddah L'Bayla? I'll repeat, is it Isser Niddah or Tumas Niddah L'Bayla? Is it a matter of the rules of applying the rules of Tumah, or is the prohibition against having a relationship with the wife a matter of Isser? What's the distinction? Who cares? So, it's a famous Tosfos apparently. in Baba Kama in 11, where it says that if a sac, it's one of those cases, a shilya, SAC, if a sac emerged from the mother partly on Monday, partly on Tuesday, one of those Gemara cases, we judge her tummy both days of Chumrah. Right? We regard her as having become tummy from the first day and on other respects from the second day. She can't finish till the second, till 7 days from the second day. The Gemara says, what's the Chiddush? We already know this law about Shilya, Shiyasa, Miksasa, right? So we already know this law about, we already know this from the law about Shchita, not being matir, the half sack that remained inside the mother cow, out of fear that the other half sack that emerged contained rove of the baby cow, which would make all the contents of the sack usher. So in other words, we have these cases of afterbirth and things like this, but here it's not the afterbirth, this is more for Moshe and the Vadakashas. There's a shilya, there's a sack, we're afraid, we don't see anything in it, we're afraid the baby dissolved. But if it's there, it was something. Now, if that's true, then you have the goof there. And then if rove comes out, it's considered that that's, right? Should be the tummy, but if not, then, if rove of the animal came out, then the shchita of the mother is not going to be matir that. On the other hand, if rove didn't come out, then it'll be like, be part of the mother, and the shchita of the mother will be matir that. It's those kind of things. Now, if you think about this for a second, we're dealing with a spec speko. Maybe the sac was empty and contained no embryo at all. And even if it contained the dissolved embryo, maybe the first half that emerged did not contain the majority of the embryo. In which case, the shchita in the mother would be matir the half of the sac remaining inside because rove didn't come out, if you can follow that. So Tosas, here's the point. So Tosas asked the question, what does it matter whether yesh mixes shilya below vlad, ain mixes shilya below vlad, the Gemara is going back there. Is it possible for part of the sac come out and not contain any of the animal or not, and so forth? What we should be looking at is where the suffix occurred. In Rab Rishus Yachid. In other words, I'm sure many will remember that in Sotah, right? The Torah calls a Sotah a tumah. The Nitma, Nistra he Nitma. And we all know this. And the very essence of the law of Sotah is she did something benistra in a Rishus Yachid. In other words, in a sefer dika place, not in public domain. And from there they learn, Safek Tumah B'Rishus Yachid, you come across this in the Gemara a lot. Safek Tumah B'Rishus Yachid is the Tameh, Safek Tumah B'Rishus Rabbim is the Tahor. It's the same thing over here. What they should be worrying about is, where did this, embryonic thing take place? In Rishus Yachid or Rishus Rabbim? Okay? Tosas says that these rules would apply whether or not a Safek would not apply to whether or not a Safek Yoletus was permitted to her husband. Okay? And to read very, very quickly, don't have it here. Here in the Hebrew it goes easier. It says, is yesh mixes shilya below vlad, ain't mixes shilya below vlad? Do we ever say it comes out with anything in it or not? And Vim Tomer, the Gemara Tosas asked, Rabbi Lezer Amar Choshim Mishum they mix shilya below vlad. It implies avoiding hoy mixes shilya below vlad. Hey, tell me, what's going on over here? Ibn Shus Rabim. If the situation took place in Shus Rabim, I feel a b'chas feikim etarim. Even if there was not a spec feikim, but even regular suffix, by the virtue of the fact that in Rishus Rabbah, Safek Tum Rishus Rabbah was a Torah. And even Rishus Yachid, if the situation was in a Rishus Yachid, I feel b'spek spekanami coming. Because the Mishnah says in Taurus that when you get to Rishus Yachid, Kol HaSvekas Yator Yochel Laharbos the Marbin. I feel spek speko. Yishlomer, the Shmait and Ari Le'ini Le'osro L'Vaila. That we weren't talking about Tumah, but we're talking about prohibiting her to her husband. But wait a minute, prohibiting to her husband is a function of Bo'ol Niddah, of Tumah. That's the funny Tosas. And what's going on over here? Why not? Why would she not be off to the husband? According to the Shev Shemites, and I won't read it to you, I'll just say it out loud, the rules of Safek Tumah Shus around the Torah and all that kind of stuff, they're functions of Hilchas Tumah. What he says, Tosas, according to him, says, what the prohibition of a Bo'el Niddah to the husband and to the wife is not a matter of Tumah, but of Isser. And by Isser, we don't have this funny rule of Safek Tumah Shus Yachid and so on, which after all makes no sense. It's only what you call something you learn, Mamatzina, from Sotah. It's just one of the strange rules. So if it's a strange rule, it only involves Tumah. Now, sota is a funny case. Sota is a case of her being also to her husband, but the Torah distinctly refers to it in languages of tumah. But over here, the Artosis wants to assert that when it comes to Isser bylaw, of a Niddah to a Boel Niddah, that's a matter of Isser, and therefore issues like where matter doesn't count. What counts is how much of a suffix is it. If it's one suffix, you're machmer. If it's a spek, you're makel. That's the idea. So that's an important yisod. It just so happens that the Rabbi Yehuda came up with this, it seems on his own, in a very interesting case. All the cases in the are interesting, but this one he's writing to a student, and he doesn't mind telling him when the guy screwed up or not, as is usual in the style. He says, "Ayom kibalti mechtavo." The questions are always interesting, even if you don't have the patience to listen to the answers. He says, "Ayom kibalti mechtavo al dvar ish ve'ishto shoy b'mita." A husband and wife were sleeping in bed, and she was expecting, Misha Muberes, B'chodesh Hashmini, or in the 8th month, all alone. B'hoisi Yishena, and she was sleeping in the middle of the night. V'isha Yaneir, and the white guy woke up in the middle of the night. V'shama kolhu b'bocha b'me'imo. He heard crying. Okay? So, I like freak him out. But in this topic, Maloso, he wish to me a Niddah, mitam kim shatinik bocha, v'adi hotzi rosh hachutz l'prosper. If she heard baby crying, then it sounds like, but the baby's not outside, so maybe stuck head out, cried, and then went back in. If that counts, well, there are such cases, and if that happened, havi psichis hakever, and then psichis hakever below down. You understand that means? In other words, then the thing broke, and she should be coming Niddah. That's it. And so the karma Niddah, the psichis hakever below down. And even though even though we have a rule that the woman is believed to say it didn't happen, but she was sleeping, so you don't know whether she knew, whether she counts or not. So anyway, what do? Do you say that al kopan ti Niddah lasvir zayin keep it field? Do we consider her that she has to be a Niddah, or do we say kim sheishena havidavar shem bodas l'shol? It's fake Torah. Or do you say you have a case of suffix tumah? And I just told you one of the funny rules, which is it depends whether it's Rosh Rabbin. Another funny rule that we learn from Sota is, by Tumah, is yesh bo das l'shol or ein bo das l'shol. The case of the Sota, obviously, is a case where it's a living person you can ask. Had there been a suffix involving a sheretz, then you wouldn't say it's tummy because ein bo das l'shol. You see? Again, that makes no sense. It's just a rule that they learned from Sota. So he wants to apply it over here. He said, and when they chomer Isser Niddah, and so what the rabbi said is, I don't know, I want to be machmer. Therefore, he said that she should immediately assume the worst and be purged from the husband and keep 7 days and then go to the mikvah. And is he right or not? And the Niddah Yehuda answers, you have many mistakes the way you just said. Okay? There's an Isser, and you screwed up royally. Racist dwarf shamar shi tameya. First of all, you say that there's no such thing as opening without any dam coming out. It's not so simple. That's the case. He says many hold not that way. That's first of all. And the bottom line is, if you're afraid a baby came out, maybe it was a girl. You have to wait 14 days, and not 7. And he goes on and on like this. And it's a very interesting too. But the point is that as far as yesh bo das l'shol or ein bo das l'shol, he said that's got nothing to do with anything over here. Why? That's a matter of tumah, like you learn from Sota. That's relevant to tumah cases. If a baby, the Gemara says, was maybe touched something, tummy or not, or whatever, or a grown-up. But here you're dealing with Isser l'bayla. By Isser we don't have these kind of rules of yesh bo das l'shol, ein bo das l'shol. You go by regular suffix rules of evidence. So once again, you see independently that they have this distinction between the tumah on the one hand and the Isser on the other. And if you say it's a matter of tumah, then all the funny rules are going to kick in. But if you say not, then you're going to do by regular rules of evidence. That's what's coming out over here. And so his point is the bol Niddah is Isser, not Niddah. All this is problematic for the Rambam because the Rambam, as I told you in the beginning, conflates the Tumas Niddah with Isser Boel Niddah all under one rubric in the Sefer Mitzvahs. According to the Rambam, one would think in the case of Sfex Vega, the wife would indeed be prohibited to the husband. It's all a matter of Tumah. The rules of Rishus Yachid ought to apply. And if this is the case, then the Kasha Tos I told you before kicks in, because why didn't the Gemara take that into account? But you can answer this through a different chakira. What did Tosas and Baba Kama say? This is cute. That in the case of the woman's sack, there's a spek sveka. Under the rules of Tumah, if the doubt occurred in Rishusi Yachid, should be Tumah, because Safek Tumah Rishusi Yachid was Tami. But since the possible listener involved is Bo'al Niddah, a spek sveka would not suffice to make her usher to her husband. As we saw, this seems to mean that because Tumah's Bo'al Niddah is a matter of Isser and not Tumah, where we would apply Rishusi Yachid, the rules of Tami, a spek sveka is not strong enough to make her usher to her husband. You need a suffix and not a spek sveka, just one suffix. But wait a minute, listen to this. What is the exact meaning of suffix Tumah Rishusi Yachid Latami, which is a well-known rule? Does this mean that, thanks to a mammoth scene of Masota, the Tumah in question, Niddah or Yoledes, is valorized by being a Rishusi Yachid? Notice, is the original Tumah, the suffix Tumah Rishusi Yachid Latami? You say that they're telling you that if it's Tumah's Niddah, or if it's Tumah's Zav, or it's Tumah's Sheretz, or whatever it is, that's what the Torah is telling you now becomes Tomei in a Rishusi Yachid. It's the same Tumah, just location valorizes the Yisr. Or is the meaning Safek Tumah Rishusi Yachid different? Does it mean that there's a distinct, separate Tumah called Safek Tumah Rishusi Yachid? Because after all, it makes no sense. Is this the rule?
Is it derisive Tumah?
It is. So, it is, that's certainly.
Okay.
A Tumah which has its own brand, not an application of the existing Tumah valorized under Torah rules in Rishusi Yachid. This is the famous Chiddush of the Chaim Gruzhinsky, right? One of those Litvish Hakiras, the Safek Tumah Rishusi Yachid, the old Tumah that you're now making strong in Rishusi Yachid, or is it a Naya Tumah, right? If so, one can say that Svek Svek of Rishusi Yachid might be enough to make her tummy with the new Tumah, called Safek Tumah Rishusi Yachid, but this new Tumah is not sufficient to make her usher to her husband, because the Torah only prohibits Tumah's Niddah, to make a Niddah to her husband, under the rule of Isser, the Bo'al Niddah. The Torah doesn't prohibit a wife whose Tumah is called Safek Tumah Rishusi Yachid. The Torah only prohibits a wife that's called, as I said before, Tomei Niddah. For this reason, Tosfos would say, a Svek Sveker Rishusi Yachid, such as the case of the embryonic sac, would not make her usher l'bal. If this is true, then even Tosfos, not the Niddah, but Tosfos would agree to the Rambam then, that Tumah's Bo'al Niddah is mitam Tumah, not mitam Isser, and that the only reason Svek Sveker Rishusi Yachid does not render usher, because it doesn't apply. For as an Indian of Tumah, it would apply, but because in order to be usher, she has to be, as I said before, Tomei Niddah, not simply Tomei B'tumah Acheres, Hanikras Svek Sveker Rishusi around the Tomei. All I want to do with that little piece was show you that something that Niddah looks like a very, and there's 1,000,001 nafkaminas, as you see from the Niddah case, that can come out of this, some of which make sense, and some which are part of the rubric of Hilchos Tumah that do not make sense. They're simply Xeris HaKosas. I just want to share, on a lighter note, one last piece over here, and then we'll have dessert, I guess. And that is, the Gemara has at the end, in terms of Agadata, they say that all the way near the end, that remember in Bechoros you have the whole thing of the sages of Athens, Rabbi Yeshua, and the Sabbath Beatuna, or whatever it means.
That was last year.
Yeah. What's that?
You did that last year.
Yeah, I'm saying, so similarly, I tell you, I lost, there's a famous article from Shaul Lieberman, and it's called The Difference Between Rome, I took it with me to Italy, the difference between Rome and Alexandria. Yeah, right, Rome and Alexandria. Do you have my book? I was wondering where it was. Anyway, I thought you. Yeah, Rome and Alexandria, and one of his points is that the Roman Jewish community. I think this is where I went, if I'm not mistaken, recently. Now I think that was. And the Roman community was very Zionistic and things like simple Jews, and it's not what you would think.
What period is he talking?
What's that?
When
the Second Temple.
Oh.
And I'll show you exactly what I'm talking about in a second. On the other hand, the Alexandrian community, they always ask these weird questions. They had a funny version of Judaism. Many times in the Gemara they talk about the fact that the Jews from Israel and Jews of Alexandria didn't get along. All kind of, and they had weird ways of looking at reality. Here's a perfect example. The Gemara says, Ton Rabbanim, Shnei Mosar Dvarim Shalu Anshe Alexandria is Yeshua ben Chananya. That the famous Rabbi Yeshua ben Chananya visited Alexandria and they asked him 12 questions. Shlosha Divri Chachma, Shlosha Divri Agadata, Shlosha Divri Buris, stupidity, and Shlosha Divri Derech Eretz. Right? And then Gemara goes on to say, Shlosha Divrei Chachma has to do with the laws of Tum and Tara. Leave that, skip over. And then he says, Shlosha Divrei Agadata. So people at Alexandria asked 3 questions about Agadata. One was, I don't want to die. And the other one says, God says he wants to die. That was easy. One where they did tshuva, one where they didn't do tshuva. But notice the focus on the death. Second, Luisa Punim. I'm sorry. Here's the part I was looking for specifically. Shlosh Dibri Boris. I'm sorry. Those were theological questions. Those are fair. There's Shlosh Dibri Boris. 3 things about stupidity. Ishta Shalot Ma'osh Matami. Lot's wife turned into a block of salt. It's to have Tumas Mason out. Right? So he says, Mace Matami, the aim Netziv Melch Matami. Okay? Ben Hashunam is Mashin Tami. Revived him from the dead. The prophet revived the Shunammite woman from the dead. Is he Matami? Mace Matami, Mechai Matami. And finally, Mason lost his love when you have the final resurrection. Will they all be Tom and Mason? You'll have that paraduma or not? So he said, look, we'll ask him what happened. Okay? Now, the Gemara presenting it as just 3 different words and all the rest, and that's the example that Lieberman gives of the weird, interest of the people of Alexandria. I think he skipped something that's very obvious. When does this all happen historically? Yeshua Mechananya. When is the first generation? What years are we talking? 80, 90?
Christianity.
Sure. Right. Sure. You understand? In proto-Christianity, they hadn't worked out yet what exactly was the Jesus thing. And there's a difference between a regular Jew and a weird Jew. Now, I mean this. Regular Jew, weird Jew. Yeshua Mechananya is a regular guy. What's the story with Lot's wife? I don't know. Like the third or pillar of salt. No, but you understand? They're focused on the question of what does it mean when you switch your substance. Right? Is it the same goof coming back? Is it not the same goof coming back? It's all the things that will eventually emerge as the cardinal principles of Christianity. The Shunammite woman, Ben Hashunam, he died, and then Elisha, boom, brought him back to life. Well, gee, what is that all about? Now again, you read the story, I read the story, what does it mean? I don't know. He did something, whatever. Because that's the old rabbinic attitude, which is, we don't know what happened exactly. We just know he did it. He made Chesed whatever it is. You see? Or what was the third one over here? When they're coming back from the dead, what state are they going to be in? But the Anchi Alexandria, or at least the people they were around, heard these famous rabbinic tales, the biblical tales, and in Greek style, they attacked them very literally, and they want to know what is the nature of the changing of a substance. And is that very focus that emerges as the core elements of the incipient Christianity, which is coming to form at that time. So, like with the Ramban and Pablo Christianity, they just move past each other. It's not a dialogue. Because they really want to know what happened. It's a fair question. What happened when she slowed? I mean, did she die and then her body was switched into salt? Was she still alive and just into salt? I mean, you get it, but it's not a Jewish question. You understand? And so you see over here early differences in fundamentals between 2 entirely different cultural traditions. That's it.